Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a doof media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host and constant reader, Scott Daly, and joining me, as always, you know him as Matt Freeman, but he's really No Face, pilot of the Meat Wagon. Hello, No Face. How's it going?
Oh, pretty good. You know, me being No Face is the least dramatic twist that's going to happen in this conversation.
This week on the show, our 11-part coverage of Stephen King's Desperation and Stephen King's 1990s reaches its finale as we take a look at the sister book to King's Desperation, Richard Bachman's The Regulators. This, Matt, is going to be a little bit different from our normal episodes, right? We're covering an entire book in one episode, so we're going to be much less in the weeds, in the details, as than our normal coverage of books. I think if you've listened to any of our book clubs in the past, it's probably going to be a little bit closer to that style of conversation than it is the normal episodes you're used to. But I wanted to do this. I wanted to do this, Matt, because I think this book being a relation to Desperation is an important part of why I picked it. This kind of grand experiment King did with these two books is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about Desperation in the first place. And so we had to read it and we had to talk about it.
And I had a lot of fun with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't know that this book would necessarily support our full deep dive. I say that I'm often surprised that a book that maybe I at first think doesn't have all that much depth will yield quite a bit of depth when you just can, essentially force yourself to talk about it and try to dig for that depth.
Mm-hmm.
But I also do feel like we did Desperation in quite a bit of depth, and
Mm-hmm.
this book being a sort of twin.
Twinner, it's a twinner. Yeah.
To Desperation, it's like, okay, we kind of covered that. We can talk about what this book says that book didn't say, and vice versa, and we don't have to do the full multi-week treatment.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a refrain that I felt while reading this book multiple times in my head was, I'm sure glad I decided to do it this way. And maybe this is just me convincing myself that I made the right decision to not cover this book in this detail. And this is just me wanting to pat myself on the back for this decision. But it felt right when I made the decision. And I think it felt right when I was reading the book. Like that
Mm-hmm.
Man, I'm enjoying this book. I'm having fun with it. And I have a lot of things to say about it. But if we had to do this for 6 weeks, 75 pages roughly a time, I think that would really affect my enjoyment of this book considerably.
And my mental state. Also.
Yeah, that too. So before we start talking about the book in a lot of detail, I think there's a real possibility that some of our listeners here did not read The Regulators, that they just read the Desperation, or they didn't read either of them and are just wanting to hear about this weird twinner book. So I thought I would just do like a really quick kind of like quick plot summary of what actually happens in this book, because it's crazy. And then we can move into the book in detail. So bear with me here, Matt. I'm going to make this as quick as I possibly can.
All right, hit me.
So Richard Bachman's The Regulators tells the story of a quintessential suburban town, a street on that town called Poplar. Is it Poplar or Poplar?
I say Poplar. I'm
okay.
as a Texan.
Okay. Poplar Street and the families that reside on it. It's a normal summer day when suddenly strange vans with weird machines on top of them show up driving down the street, and they start opening fire and killing random people. The first person to die is the paper boy and a dog, and then it just gets worse from there. We eventually learn that these are motocops, which are toys that were summoned into existence by a very special little boy who has a very evil spirit inside him, named Tack, which we will recognize from Desperation. Our characters band together and eventually defeat Tack. And it doesn't end well for a lot of the characters. The big thing about this is the reason we call it a twinner is because many characters in the story have the same names as characters in Desperation. Obviously, we already talked about Tack and that similarity, but we also have Johnny Marinville back again. We have David Carver. We have Audrey. Some of them are closer to their counterparts than others. Some of them not really related at all except for a name, and then you have ones like Johnny Marinville, who it seems like almost a sliding doors type of comparison between the character we get in Desperation and the character we get in the Regulators.
Hmm.
It's all really interesting, and it's kind of a crazy book because it is, there's a young autistic boy who has, I don't know if it's specifically the shine, but has special powers, and Tack uses these special powers in order to summon a combination of a Western violent movie and a 90s kids cartoon to wreak havoc in this suburban neighborhood, and
Hmm.
eventually turning it into his own warped version of a Western town. um it's crazy. I think a lot of fun. But I want to know what you think, Matt. What did you think of the Regulators?
I did have a lot of fun. I read this very quickly. In fact, I sort of forgot that we were doing the Desperation movie last week, so I read it so fast, and then it's actually been a while since I finished it. And the
Oh man.
reason I read it fast was that I was enjoying it. Like especially, by the way, there was, the audiobook read by Frank Muller, and so
Hmm.
that's always a particular joy. And it's just like this fun, seedy, violent, horrible kind of nightmare, but it's the fun. There's a reason I said fun in there first, because tonally it goes down a lot smoother than Desperation, which is, I think, really interesting, because in many ways worse things happen than happen in Desperation. I guess
Yeah.
you could kind of argue it either way, and case by case, but like it's sort of a rougher book than Desperation, but also like the tonal choices that it makes sort of make it feel more like a Western or something, rather than the like religious epic that is Desperation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We talked last week about the adaptation of Desperation and how it had this kind of silly tone to it. I think we kind of said that probably because that's kind of how Mick Garris saw the material and approached the material of Desperation, and maybe we kind of disagreed with that tone. But I think that tone fits perfectly with this book, a book that, as you're right, is incredibly violent, incredibly dark. I mean, the ending of this book, the characters winning and defeating the bad guy, is a racist woman barging into a house and shooting an autistic kid in the neck,
Yeah.
and head, and that's like, we won.
Uh-huh.
We did it. Yeah, incredibly violent, incredibly disturbing story, but I think it is built to have a kind of dark fun to it. And I did enjoy that. You know I said this at the very beginning of this whole series, and I'm going to remind everyone of it here. This is the first Stephen King novel I ever read in my
Yeah.
life. Was was Richard Bachman's The Regulators, which, is only now that I'm doing this podcast really sitting with me on how fucking crazy that is.
Yeah.
Actually.
It's very funny. Like I was like halfway through this book and just realizing, like, this being someone's first experience with Stephen King, it's such a, you know, just individually, it's an insane, wild book, and then also it's just quite uncharacteristic for Stephen King, really, in so many
Yeah.
ways.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. While I still think is recognizably King, right? I mean,
mhm.
I definitely think he's trying to do the Bachman thing here that we've talked about, but he's also, I don't know. I think there's two different ways of talking about this book. The first one is looking at it as a standalone novel and just talking about how it functions as a narrative, which I think we need to do. And the second one is how it functions as a mirror or a twin to Desperation. And that, I think, in my opinion, is the much more interesting conversation, because I think the one thing, and maybe you'll disagree with me on this, but the one critique of this book I have is that it's really not about anything. Like,
Uh-huh.
fun stuff happens, certainly. There are characters that go through an event and it's a fun story, and you could maybe try to glean some symbolism or metaphor out of some of this stuff. But I think the only way I was able to like extract metaphor or meaning out of the story is in the ways it compares to Desperation. But just as a story by itself, there's not a lot to hold on to and grip onto as far as having really in-depth conversations. I think, honestly, the problem I had with Desperation, with a lot of the character work, I think is compounded here, is worse in the Regulators.
Yeah.
And so that second conversation is the one I want to spend more time on. But I think there is value in just approaching this as a standalone novel in itself and talking about it in that regard.
Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, one just historical note, which I think is relevant to this, is that apparently the book began its life as a screenplay titled "The Shotgunners," um,
Okay.
which then the director um, who King was planning to work with passed away,
Yeah, that's
and
Sam Peckinpah, the very famous Western director. Yeah.
right, and so King then adapted it. And so we obviously have no idea what form that original screenplay took, but um, this is one of those King books that has multiple premises crammed into it, where we've got this idea of, the story of the Regulators, which is the story within a story, which maybe that's what the original screenplay was. Who knows?
Mhm.
Is basically a classic Western where you've got banditos coming into town, and the law has to rally the town people to stand up against them, and you've got a love interest and all that stuff. And then wrapped around that is this sort of Twilight Zone plot, which is very reminiscent of like the little kid with powers, and you can't cross the little kid. King, I feel safe in saying that King liked that idea and wanted to sort of riff on that idea. Obviously, it's not just an evil little kid; it's Tack possessing a little kid, but
Yeah.
the idea of the little kid having massive psychic powers and being terrifying, and Tack acts very childlike regardless. So he might as well be a little kid in this
Yeah.
book. And this all comes together. We also stir in this element of the moto cops, which I know the timing doesn't quite line up, but I kind of saw the moto cops as a critique of the quite violent and very sort of bizarre cartoons that I watched as a child. Now, of course, this book came out a bit late for that, but I still feel like I feel like a lot of the inspiration for this book must have been King seeing some children, maybe not his own children, maybe his grandchildren, who knows, watching, I don't know, G.I. Joe or something, and being like, what the hell is this? And inventing the moto cops as his own sort of like, acid trip derived concept for a children's cartoon show.
Yeah.
And he just stirs all this together, and then sort of like out of left field, at like a right angle to everything, he's like, and by the way, these are mirroring / refracting the characters from this other novel, Desperation, and then he works in all these synergies, but that didn't feel like that was the original idea to me. It felt
No.
like this was a weird hairy story that he wrote, and then later in the game he decided to stitch in all the stuff about the Desperation connections.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there for sure. And the interesting thing about it is, and I did kind of a impromptu poll on Twitter today because I was curious what people thought, just like which book is better in your opinion. And it looks like as of this recording, about 75% of people said Desperation is better, which is probably about what I figured, right? That like
Mhm.
3/4 of people, the people that said they like the Regulators, said for most of the stuff we talked about, it's really fun. It's a really fun ride. It's weird. It's kind of bombastic and wild, and they appreciated that part of it. But yeah, I mean, it does feel like this. You're absolutely right. An amalgamation of ideas and things, and again, I think as is uncharacteristic of King, the characters kind of get lost in it for me a little bit, with some exceptions. I think to me, it feels like the Audrey and Seth stuff is the stuff that King spent the most amount of time on, and I was really into those two characters, Audrey especially. I thought that stuff was really interesting. That was the stuff I was enjoying most of the book. And then as you kind of spread out from her house to cover the rest of the neighborhood, you just get thinner and thinner as far as characterization, to the point where, frankly, and I've read this book before multiple times actually, I was having trouble remembering who was who in the neighborhood. Like when the book is referencing certain characters, like just what's the difference between the Debbie Ross, Susie Geller, and Kim Geller, and Cammie Reed, and like all these people, and I'm like, I don't remember the difference between these people, and I had multiple times when King would reference a name, I would have to like stop. And in the version of the book I have, it has like a picture that is like a map of the street with all the houses on the left and right side of the street. And I would turn to that to refresh my memories. Like, okay, so she's the mom of this character. Okay, got it. And just I don't have that experience in King novels very
Yeah.
often.
Yeah, I felt a little bit of that. I will say the voice acting helped me keep track. And,
That's fair. Yeah.
we kill people off so quickly that if you were having trouble keeping track, well, you don't have to keep track for long.
Fair. Yeah.
I,
I do like it starts with Carrie Ripton in both books, by the way. It's just in this one he's a poor kid that's just a paper boy. But yeah, so let's really dive into this thing, because I like what you said about the 90s cartoons. I think the little snapshots of the moto cops we get is just, it sounds insane, but
uh-huh.
insane in a very recognizable way that I'm like, yeah, like I could see this being like, how different is this from the zany shit that happens in Power Rangers, right?
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
it could,
yeah. Ninja Turtles is what I kept thinking
yeah.
about.
Oh yeah.
Where like,
I
yeah.
I have been watching the Ninja Turtles cartoon recently because I showed it to my son,
Uh-huh.
and like I don't know what I expected, but man, it just kind of throws you in there in that cartoon. Like
Uh-huh.
episode 1, you see Shredder and Kang, and they're just like, yeah, I mean, obviously there's this fucking little alien brain from Dimension X. Duh.
Yeah.
What did you think? And it's like, I thought we built up to that in this cartoon. No. It was like this from the beginning. And yeah, I mean that's very reminiscent of the Motocop shit for sure.
Yeah, I don't think I ever really understood what was happening in Ninja Turtles episodes when I was a kid, which,
No,
it's fine.
it's wild. And basically the entire first season is like one long story actually, which
Uh-huh.
is wild to think about because like they just didn't do that back then.
Yeah.
Uh, but man, the turtles just kind of walk around New York City without any disguises on, and no one really says anything. It's kind of wild. Anyway, that's a crazy cartoon. Loved it as a kid, but it's crazy. And this is, I think you're absolutely right. Summoning that and to do something interesting. And I guess, do we want to say like, is this saying something about the media that children consume a little bit here? It's so I want to read into this stuff, but I struggle with it. I really do.
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is yes, but I'm not sure if we're supposed to take anything from that, along the lines of like, oh, they shouldn't be allowed to, because the kid he watches the cartoon, the Moto Cops, and then he also ends up watching this violent Western. And then in
Yeah.
his mind, the two stories sort of merge together, and a pastiche is created, which I think is fun, and calls back to a lot of our conversations about King, where he loves pastiche. And
Hmm.
I think he would say that it's actually great the way children will take different stories and mash them together,
Yeah.
because that's kind of what King likes to do too.
Hmm. Hmm.
But here he has this kid who's doing it and then projecting it out onto the world around him. I mean, in a sense, it's you could totally flip the thing on its head and be like, here Tack is Stephen King. Stephen King is Tack. He's creating this bizarre, violent pastiche and then projecting it into our minds,
Yeah.
and torturing us with it in a sense. I don't know if that's intended, but it's a fun idea.
Yeah. I also think there's the idea that we're saying something about suburbia and Americana here, like especially in the mid 90s. This is this picturesque summer in America in the 90s in suburbia, and we're going to come in and completely destroy it. And in destroying it, I think we do reveal some of the underlying issues at the bottom of it. Like I was really interested in the, that we have I can't, the Josephson characters who are, the only black couple on the street. And it says at the very beginning of the novel, and everyone else was very proud of that fact, right? They were like, yes, these are our token black friends.
Uh-huh.
And then like the second the chips are down, suddenly Kim Geller turns into this giant racist monster, right?
Yeah.
Like she just goes crazy all of a sudden, and perhaps reveals what was underneath all along. actually.
Hmm.
And I do think we're saying something about that, like there's also people like Kali and Trajan, who in this story is a cop still, but a fired cop, because he was, we learn, framed for a crime he did not commit, for was it selling drugs or
No, I mean, what he says as he dies. So, yeah, I actually like this, by the way. So, we learn earlier that he failed a drug test, but then
Mhm.
as he dies, he says he never did any drugs. It was the internal affairs
Oh
guys
yeah.
who set him up.
Yep. He was set up because he found out that internal affairs was corrupt itself, and was uh, destroyed from being a cop from that. And very interesting character there, because again, we're talking about, corruption and systems and problems, and these things I think are all like on the floating on the exterior of this central story of, man, isn't it crazy how that wolf looks like it was drawn by a kid but it's also eating us. Like I see all this stuff here and I want to grab it and pick at it and say, oh, this is very, very interesting and a wonderful examination of things. But ultimately it's just a fun story, like and that's it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I basically agree. I'm not sure how much more I can say about that. I mean, I like. It's a very fun idea to
Hmm.
have these different characters, and then you play with them in different ways. And I do mean, like, it's not like he has there's a certain twist that he applies to every character. As you said, there's a different twist that he applies to every character.
Yeah.
So, I to stay on Intragian for a second, I found it just extremely satisfying because you only learn the slightest amount of information about Kali and Trajan as a man in Desperation. You have this feeling that, like, just, bad luck, poor guy. And then in this book, it feels like we kind of learn who that guy was.
Hmm.
And the funny thing is that could totally be bullshit because this is not really the same guy.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you kind of feel like he is nonetheless. And what's cool is that he's actually like a good guy. He's heroic. He's trying to do the right thing at all times. I like the beat where everybody on the street believes a different wrong rumor about why he was fired.
Yeah.
Um, and and then he dies in a very tragic way, but like
Hmm.
he kind of dies on his, I mean, not literally on his feet, but he's doing his best, and then he dies, and it sucks. But you feel like, this is a better death for Kali and Trajan
Yeah.
than the death that he got in the other book.
I
Um,
agree, and I loved that his final words were him, like the thing that was most important to him as he lay there dying
mhm,
was that someone, it doesn't matter who, but someone knew the truth about him. That,
mhm, mhm,
like that, I think it was Cynthia who is there with him when he dies, who is, brand new to the town and not anyone that has the ability to really relay that information to set the record straight or whatever. But it's just he just needs someone to know, because it does seem like being a cop was very important to him, and being being a good cop was very important to him,
mhm.
and that was all taken away from him because he was good.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and yeah, it's a great character. I agree. I once again, this is the second book with Kali and Trajan that I've read where I thought the book lost something as soon as Kali and Trajan exited the story, and I wish he was around longer.
Yeah.
Um, I do think that's like it's just an interesting, the greatest part of this book to me, and is everything basically up until he dies, almost. Like I think this is one of those books where the setup to me is infinitely more fascinating than the payoff.
Mhm,
That just the we talked about how the beginning of Desperation is so good because it puts you in this very mundane, relatable situation, a high tension situation where a cop is pulling you over, and it really milks that for all the wonderful tension, and it's just really, really engaging. I thought the first part of this book was so cool in that, like, we're setting things up at to be just this very normal day, and yet, like, the storm is on the rise, that like there's something that's about to happen, and then as we pay off and suddenly there are vans here and we don't know who's in the vans, and they're killing people. What's going on? They're killing people and they drive away, and you're meeting all these characters, and then Mary Jackson shows up and she's having an affair, and then there's that whole bit with she's not wearing underwear that goes
Uh-huh.
on for a very long time, which at 38 I'm like, geez, Richard Bachman. But at 13, Matt, at 13 I was
Uh-huh.
like, okay, I'm
Yeah.
in. I
Yeah.
didn't know you could write books about this. A
Yeah.
woman with not wearing underwear. You've got me. You've got me, Steven. But just like it's all like very specific and weird and focused. And then I don't know. I feel like it gets almost too goofy when we
Mhm.
start moving from that in a way that I think makes sense because it's supposed to be like this children's cartoon, this pastiche you're talking about is kind of coming to life. But I
Yeah.
know it loses me a little bit as it moves into that.
Sure. Yeah, right. I mean, I think the mystery of what the hell is going on with these vans is intriguing, similarly to the mystery of like who's this Colleen Trajan guy who's putting
Hmm.
people in
Hmm.
jail cells. And then so in both cases, I didn't actually find the reveal disappointing. Like I don't find the idea of like, oh, he's being possessed by a demon in the one case, and oh, he's being possessed by a demon and creating hallucination trucks in the other. I don't actually find those to be disappointing reveals. Those are to me sort of fun reveals, but it's like, oh, okay, well now what? And then in both cases, the now what is just like, well, we have to kill the evil thing. And
Hmm.
and it's not that that's bad either. It's just it's like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. And then it kind of writes itself from that point. Like
Yeah.
that's the thing, is it all feels very creative and wild and fun. And then kind of at a certain point, you're just like, yeah, and then they have to kill the evil. And then it's almost like this is maybe too harsh, but it's almost like King loses interest and he knows he has to finish. So he just kind of finishes and it's
Yeah.
fine,
Okay.
you know? Um,
Hmm. Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I agree. Like I'm not saying here that the reveal didn't work, it didn't function. I just think like that first part of it is inherently just more interesting to me. And
yeah.
it lost me from there.
Yeah. I agree.
One thing I did want to talk about is the choice to do kind of the epistolary sections in this book, which is something that King has done before, has not done lately, did not do at all in Desperation, but is a pretty big part of the Regulators. We have sections that are newspaper clippings. We have sections that are Audrey's diary. We have a whole big long section of the confession of the mine operator that took Seth and his family down into the China pit. Uh, these sections are a pretty big chunk of the novel, and I'm wondering what you thought of them.
I love them. I wanted to talk about those too. They're very fun. Um, I just enjoy that kind of thing for its own sake, really.
Sure.
I like it when the voice kind of changes up, and um, I don't know. Again, it's funny. It's like, what purpose do they serve beyond being fun? I don't know. I can't answer that, but I think
Mhm.
I just enjoyed that stuff. I particularly enjoy the like Motocops script because it's just funny. It's just
It
strange
is.
and weird and funny.
Yeah, it is. It is really funny. Like I love that there's always like a character that is like the character everyone beats up on,
Yeah.
verbally. Like I feel like that exists in every single show. Like I'm watching the real Ghostbusters cartoon with my son right now, and that's Slimer. Like Slimer is just the character that everyone just verbally beats up on. He just exists to be that for some reason.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll say about it, and this is like this is a weird complaint, but aesthetically the way they look in the book is, the Audrey journal sections are written in cursive, like it's a different font. It's like it's a cursive font as if Audrey's writing it, and I didn't have any problem reading that. But the section from the mine worker is made to look like it's typed with a typewriter onto paper, and like to make it more realistic they made it look like, old fashioned typewriters, when it's grabbing the ink and putting it on, it doesn't always stamp the letter perfectly.
Uh-huh.
And just maybe this is just a symbol of me getting old and my eyesight starting to get bad, but like I had trouble reading some of it sometimes. Like I could not be in low light and read that section. I needed a light overhead to really read it all, because some of it gets it's just a little dim at times.
Yeah.
So that's a weird complaint, because like that's not, I don't know, like did King like insist you have to do this particular thing? Probably not. I like that it does change up the font. I like that choice, but it was a struggle to read a little bit of that sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, that wasn't a problem for me, but
Sure, yeah.
it is funny. Funny how they do that.
No, I mean, I agree with you though. I like the epistolary sections. I like epistolary sections in novels in general. I think they're fun. They change it up. They give you a different tone, a different pace. If they're well done, right? You know, they can be done poorly. But I think they are well done here. I also think they like sometimes just solve narrative problems. Like if you're thinking to yourself, how do I relay what happened to Seth in that cave,
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
a way that's interesting, and also a way that none of the characters except for Seth know about it, right? Like, so how do we do this? And oh, here's a way we solve it. It's the true confession um the guy that led them down there, which is like, I don't know, like if you compare this to like Carrie, for instance. Carrie was an epistolary novel where basically the storyline of the book was interspersed with all these newspaper clippings and books and things, as a way of presenting it to the audience that this thing that happened to Carrie White was studied and written about for years and years and years. And that was kind of the table setting for why we're seeing this stuff. With the Regulators, I'm like, are we saying that like Audrey's journal was discovered at some point? This confession was discovered at some point, and someone is like compiling the mystery of what happened on Poplar Street. Never really establishes that, but I guess that's what we're doing.
I don't even think that's. I mean, sure. If I'm not going to argue with you, right? Like if you like that idea, that's fine, and that can be the way you see the story. I think for me, it's just this ride King's taking us on, and he's throwing these
Sure.
elements in there, and he's like, oh, I need to explain how this happened. Well, it'll be boring if I just like said it, so I'm going to do it
Yeah.
in this epistolary way.
Well, I think
Or
it's like the difference between like The Office, which is television show basically framed on the fact that someone's making a documentary
Mhm.
about the office life, and like in the very end of that show, they like the documentary is a real thing that exists and comes out and is real,
Uh-huh.
versus like Parks and Rec, which does in essence the exact same thing, but just never never like mentions or
Yeah.
explains the fact that these people are just recording them with cameras for 6 years or something.
Right.
And like in that case, I liked the Parks and Rec solution better. Like, I'm not saying like I needed the scaffolding on this epistolary section to like, why does this make sense? I just thought it was interesting that he did it a little differently this time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that lends toward the tone feeling so different, because
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
the desperation does, as far as I can recall, nothing like that. I mean, it's and what I mean is when we need to tell a story about the past, for example, then we very intentionally have another character tell that story, or we give David Carver a specific vision where someone says that thing, or he sees something, or what have you. And it's all very much in the story. It's in the frame of the story, and it feels
Sure.
more
Yeah.
serious. This feels more silly, like you said, more
Mm-hmm.
lighter tone. I think the epistolary stuff lends toward that. Like there's just there's a multi-page excerpt from just the script of a cartoon show, right? It's like that's not. There's no reason to do that other than just like, hey, this is crazy, right? This is funny. People will enjoy this, right? That's basically King sitting there going like, okay, I have in my mind a scene from this weird ass cartoon show that I've concocted. It would be fun to just have that scene be in the book with no
Yeah.
explanation, and then he
Yeah.
does that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it does create this interesting thing though, where we have these two novels, and we have Desperation, a novel written by Stephen King, and then we have The Regulators, a novel written by Richard Bachman, quote unquote. And by like choosing one over another to put his real name on, what he's kind of done is say, like, this is the real one, like this is the one that counts, and then this over here is like the the second, like it relates to it, but like I don't think this one's as good. It's almost as if he's signaling that to us, right? Like
Mhm.
whenever you put your name on something and don't put your name on something else that you're releasing, like you're signaling to the world, this one's good, this one maybe a little less good.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's interesting to me, like I think there are ways in which Desperation does function as a Bachman story as well, because like everything we talked about with Desperation, it's mean, it's harsh, it's very cruel, and I do think that functions as a Bachman story a lot. But I think thematically and the things that King is exploring with that story is just such quintessential Stephen King that it had to be the one. It had to be the one that was the King one, and this one had to be the one that was the Bachman one.
Yeah, I agree, because I think a lot of the soul of the book is just different.
Yeah.
It's not a different book that's making the same point from a different angle. It's hitting upon similar ideas and motifs, but I mean, it's interesting. I wonder if it's time to talk about like the specific characters and go through the one by one kind of comparison and contrast, because
Yeah, let's do it.
I mean, I think maybe as a general statement, which we could sort of disprove as we go, but it feels to me like in almost every case, the character's journey in the Regulators is like less meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
less purposeful,
Yep.
less consequential,
Yep.
and maybe with the one exception being Audrey. So we can start. I definitely want to talk about. Okay, we got to talk about Johnny, but I almost just offhand want to mention how funny it is that as soon as David Carver is introduced, I was like, "Oh, okay, it's David Carver. So here's going to be our main character," and he's fucking blown away pointlessly, like immediately.
Yeah.
And you're like, "Okay, I can't necessarily rely on anything being consistent." All right.
Yeah, and I think like that is such an interesting thing to talk about, because like you wonder, did King write this with the idea that you're probably going to read Desperation first in mind?
Mm-hmm. I
I
don't
think
know.
he
Yeah.
did. I think he did. Like, I think he wanted it to function as, if you're a weirdo like me and you pick up the Regulators and say, I'm going to read this book first. I think he wanted it to function that way for sure. But I feel like when you're doing this grand experiment that he's doing with these two novels, and you're putting your name on one, and you're not putting your name on the other, like the one that most people are going to read first, if they're reading both, is going to be the one that says Stephen King on it. And so, like, I do think some of these changes and some of the things he does with these characters in the Regulators are specifically done to kind of poke fun at the reader as they're coming into this book with a certain level of expectation.
Mm-hmm. I think you're totally right.
And I think David Carver is a perfect example of that. And I think the Carvers in general are one of the more interesting changes King makes here, right? Because in Desperation, Ralph and Ellen Carver were the parents, and the children were Pi and David, our main character of that book. In the Regulators, that is switched. Pi and David Carver are the married adults, and Ralph and Ellie are the two children. And that's I think like the almost one of the biggest changes that was made here.
Yeah.
That like just of switching that, like essentially switching the whole relationship between all these characters. And it turns out what essentially happens is none of these characters matter at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you're there. I guess I would say, while we're playing with everything, this is just like an inversion along every axis, where the ages are flipped. The importance of David Carver is like inverted. He goes from being the most important character, this highly spiritual character who's incredibly consequential to the plot, and here he's just nothing. He dies immediately. And it's and then the children are orphaned, which I guess is one of the parallels, is like David is orphaned.
Yeah.
And here the two children are orphaned while they both survive. I thought for a while we were going to do something with Ralph Carver, the child, because he's such a little shit. I was like, is he like the anti-David? Is he like evil? And we kind of didn't do that. Like he just becomes horribly traumatized, and it's sad. It's that I think I agree. I basically agree with you that a lot of that just has to do with keeping you on your toes.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you have the characters of Steve and Cynthia,
Hmm.
who are essentially the same
Yeah,
versions of themselves.
the
Like,
closest I would say.
yeah,
Yeah.
like Steve is obviously not following Johnny through his um uh, tour through America, but he is driving across the country. He still works in music. He works for a band. Cynthia is not hitchhiking across the country, but she's not from here too. She's new here. She's still got her two-toned hair. They are, for all intents and purposes, the same people. Like
Hmm.
we don't hear anything about Cynthia's past with men like we do in Desperation, but we can maybe assume it's similar. I think the one thing to point out is Cynthia was heading to California in Desperation, and in Regulators she's from California, so I guess we inverse that a little bit, but we just don't get to know them enough to like know if there's any real big differences between, and it just seems like there's not.
It seems like there's not. I will say this is the one place where the Bachman of it really stands out to me, which is that they're just like the way they're written in a ineffable sense feels different. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I can even nail it down any further than that, but just um like for example, they don't seem to sort of um Steve doesn't spend a bunch of time staring at her boobs, and then we don't have the like sort of romance subplot that is somewhat present in Desperation,
Yeah,
and that to me felt like a choice to be like, well, they're kind of the same people, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have the same evolution of the plot with them in this story.
yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I think I feel like they did do a little bit of work, King did, to like show that there's some sort of attraction between the two of them, but
Yeah,
it is so in the background of everything that's happening. So
yeah. Well, I agree, but the thing is, even while I was like thinking that while reading the book, I was like, am I just thinking this because I just read the Desperation and I'm primed to look for it.
yeah, yeah, that
Um,
could be. We already talked about Intragian a little bit. Anything else you wanted to say about his kind of different sides?
I don't think in Trajan. I mean, I definitely want to talk about Tack as a character.
Okay.
We do that now.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because I this is one of the most enjoyable elements to me, as just like a enjoyer of sci-fi fantasy, is the fact that we knew all of these rules about Tack and about the Kanta,
Hmm.
and we understood that Tack can move between bodies, but that he uses them up quickly, so he has to change bodies. We understood that the Kanta are sort of this sort of extension of his power, but not, but he can't control it that well, and that he came from this hole in the desert, and a few other things I'm probably failing to think of right now, and also just like a certain sort of personality associated with Tack.
Hmm.
And a lot of the fun of the book of this book was sort of figuring out like which rules still hold or which rules kind of hold but they're different.
Yeah.
And just like, for example, the idea that he uses up his host, it's like, yeah, that rule is there, but it's like it's being interpreted by a different author, because it doesn't wear you out over the course of a day or three. It just explodes you immediately, un- unless you're an adequate host,
Yeah.
which Seth just happens to be like this rare host who just has a powerful shine, and he can accommodate this being. And then
Yeah.
like, okay, well, we don't have the Kantaz, we don't have this like sort of background element of latent power, but we do have the fact that if he consumes enough energy, he can just sort of start distorting the environment around him with his mind. And there's a lot of these things where it's like, well, it's not the same, but it's a really fun riff on it, and it does feel like it's this is Richard Bachman's take on the
Hmm.
on Tack's power set, right? And I really enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I mean, like, I think it is a type of thing where at first glance you would maybe assume and expect that like if the origin of Tack, like Tack still comes from the China Pit in Desperation, Nevada, right? Like that is still true in this story. So you would say, okay, maybe like everything else is different, but like this evil, this essential evil that exists is like going to be the one universal between worlds, right? Like between
Mhm.
levels of the tower, there is this core evil that is Tack.
Mhm.
But that's not exactly true, right? Like it does not work that way. It is Tack is different.
Yeah.
He's similar, but different.
Right. And it's not like this Tack ever thinks like, oh, these people again, or right. Like
Right, right.
there's no overt idea that like Tack is just poking his head into different realities. It's like
Yeah.
this might as well
Mhm.
be a totally different dude. Just like every other character in the story. This is
Yeah.
just another Tack.
And Tack's obsession with religion in Desperation is nowhere to be found in this version of the character. And I
Mhm.
mean we have to talk about that, and we'll definitely get to that. Is the religion versus lack of religion between these two novels? I think
Mhm.
is a big thing with it. But I liked Tack a lot in this book. I liked. I thought that the only thing that I thought that was a little weird was like the subplot about how the one thing Tack really wants is to fuck and
Uh-huh.
it can't and
Very
that
Bachman.
bothers him.
Extremely Bachman right there.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And I also love the detail that like it just really hates shitting. like it's
Yeah.
just like it's this monstrous entity that is like doing terrible thing and murdering people and destroy and like take and reveling in it all. But like the one thing that's just like beyond the pale for it is poop.
Uh-huh.
And I thought that was such a fun, disgusting but fun detail. Like the weakness is X-Lax. That's how we defeat Tack
Yeah.
is just by David shitting his pants.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Not
love
David,
it.
sorry, Seth. Yeah.
Seth, yeah, no, but I thought that was great. I mean, that's like I really did enjoy this book. It was very fun.
Mhm.
The reveal, like I don't know, like it makes sense in a weird way that I can't explain. That the demon would just be disgusted by the act of defecation, and
Well,
just
it is one of like the quintessentially like human things.
mhm,
Like everybody poops, right? Like we all
yeah,
poop, and the one thing that it cannot stand is that.
yeah. It's this part of being alive that is a necessity, and yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know. It's and then the idea that we're going to use X-Lax to beat him is just great. It's just so good.
Mhm.
There was a lot of a surprising amount of the horror in this book. It is actually just from Audrey's point of view. I mean, we talked about this a little bit, but like there's all the horror of just like people being gunned down by these weird vans, which is disturbing in one way. But just like Audrey being a prisoner in her own home, sort of being tormented by this demon who has the
Yeah.
powers of the Twilight Zone kid, the house being like smelling like rotting hamburger meat and like sticky from what was it, chocolate milk or
Chocolate milk.
something.
Yeah, it's
Um,
chocolate milk. It's yeah, I think the Twilight Zone comparison is apt because it's like living with a toddler that has full control over everything and
yeah,
how fucking gross that would be. Yeah.
yeah, like a lot of that was just like viscerally gross and um upsetting in a way that, I mean, even the more sort of overtly violent stuff in the book wasn't as upsetting to me as a lot of the just like Audrey dealing with Tack in the
Mhm.
house stuff was.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, like it is a nightmare like scenario. Like when we meet
Mhm,
her in the book, her husband has already been killed.
mhm,
Made to look like suicide, but basically used up and spit out by Tack.
mhm,
And her life has been just an absolute nightmare. And the one part I really liked was when Johnny gets into the house, the realization that he comes to is like, oh my god, like this woman has been living this way for months, and like none of us noticed it. Like
mhm.
this idea of this neighborhood community, everyone lives on the same street and everyone's friendly with each other and they all like each other, but really they don't interact very much at all. Like they have this very like healthy neighborly uh, distance between them where
Mhm.
they're not really at all concerned with each other's lives in any real way, actually. And
Yeah.
this woman could be alone in this house suffering and being tortured essentially, and nobody has any idea about it at all. I thought was great.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's I'm glad you said that, because I had this thought like toward the beginning of the book that I then just totally forgot about until this moment, which was like, okay, so we're doing something where we're actually paralleling the idea of this desolate shithole mining town, that's 100 years past its prime, and this uh, perfect Americana suburban street, and we're going to parallel these in interesting ways and say, is this suburban street in some ways actually fundamentally, spiritually
Hmm.
a desolate wasteland, and stuff like that. I think says yes, because it's like Audrey is right there. I mean, the parallel to Desperation is that Audrey is possessed in Desperation, or at least let's say more generally, she's like a primary victim of this evil in a way that
Yeah.
nobody else quite is.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing happens here. Actually, she's not possessed, but um she is somewhat possessed in this book. Actually, she's
Yeah.
forced to slap herself and beat herself up and such. So
Yeah.
it's like, and that's happening right under everyone's noses. So it's like, okay, so what have we really won ourselves with this nice suburban picturesque street, when the same sort of horror can happen in both scenarios, I guess.
Yeah, and I think fitting into that, when Tack starts, turning Poplar Street into Desperation, like a lot of the places that those turn into that we're told
Hmm.
are locales from that we saw in Desperation. Like we see that Tom Billingsley's house turns into Worrell's dry goods store, which was a store, the grocery store that they went into in Desperation.
Hmm.
That was the name of it. The Lushan's Chinese laundry that the Jackson's house turns into. The Lushan brothers were the ones that caused the cave in. Like, it is essentially becoming Desperation.
Hmm.
And I think it's doing that for the exact reason you said, that we're paralleling this, and I like the idea that in Desperation, the destruction of the town happened over the course of like 3 days, 4 days. It was very, very quick. It was just
Uh-huh.
like Tack was released and blah, everything's dead, everyone's dead, everything's rotting. In with the Regulators, it's a slow process, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
Audrey's death and torture is slow, and it takes a while. And I wonder if that is a commentary on like the it is a like kind of a rotten to its core system and existence here, but it is one that will take a long time to expose itself.
Hmm.
That evil, that rot, that desolate nature of suburban America,
Hmm.
only exposes itself very slowly over time, not
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah, and I think, despite this being a Bachman book, does play a lot into King's recurring motif of towns, which,
Yeah. Hmm.
a suburban street is not quite a town, but
Yeah.
at least the way these people relate to each other does feel very town like,
Hmm.
in some of in the same way that some of the other books that we've read.
Yeah. Yeah.
Poplar Street feels like a town, even though, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's part of a larger town, but yeah, in the framing of the book, it essentially is its own its own island.
Yeah,
Metaphorically at first, and then just literally by the
yeah,
end of the show
yeah, exactly.
book.
Yeah,
Yeah, I do want to talk about Johnny quite a bit.
right.
And I think the talk about Johnny will lead us into the big differences in theming here, that I think is the way in which this book kind of opens itself up to me when I start thinking about the fact that Desperation was a book all about God, and God is not present in this novel at all.
Hmm.
And I think that the way to start with that is the character of Johnny, who, as we talked about in Desperation and in this novel, was a famous novelist, um, a drunk who, got himself sober, and then, with the assistance of his ex-wife Terry, came up with a new plan for his life. In Desperation, it was he's going to return to these nonfiction essays he wrote and write this collection of essays. He's going to travel across the country and do that. In the Regulators, however, Terry suggests he go back to a kids book that he wrote when he was younger. Um, and in the Regulators, that kids book was enormously successful. It became a whole chain of kids books, and he is like happily living in suburbia, a very, very rich, successful child book author. In the Regulators, he finds God and dies. In Desperation, he finds God and dies. In the Regulators, he does not and lives.
Yeah.
And I guess Matt, so my question is, huh?
Yeah.
Where do you want to begin with this? Because I think this is kind of the key to unlocking what I think is most interesting about this experiment is this guy.
Yeah. Well, I don't pretend that I know how to unlock it, but I agree that he is. We said David Carver is the main character, and he basically is the main character of the other book. But I think there's a better case to be made that Johnny is the main character of both books, and is in fact
Mm-hmm.
sort of the main character of the Desperation slash Regulators experiment, because
Yeah.
he's so prominent in both of them. Um, and also, yes, like you said before, he does feel the closest to, like, these two levels of the tower are very close together.
Yeah.
And there's a just like a couple of choices he made differently, and that led to him being here instead of there. I say that, and yet he does feel like 90% less of an asshole in this
Yeah.
book. There's no mention of him being a wife beater.
Mm-hmm.
Um, his alcoholism is I guess referenced, but it's like, yeah, but he, dealt with it. It's fine now,
Well,
right?
he dealt with it in Desperation too.
Hmm.
He's in both stories. He's sober entering the
Hmm.
story, but
Hmm.
he's in a very different place. And I agree with you. Like, this Johnny is maybe 15% of the asshole that Desperation Johnny is.
Right.
And I guess the question there is he essentially a different person in the way some of these other characters are different people, or is he the same person and this is just a reflection of he made a better choice
Uh-huh.
in this story and therefore is a better person because of it? Like, is this the version of Johnny that we wanted to see live in Desperation? Like, is this what perhaps that person would maybe turn into if he was given the opportunity to do so? um
Yeah.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, he gets to live. He gets to have
Yeah.
what seems like a happy and contented life. Like, he seems plugged in with the neighborhood. He has friends
Yeah.
among the other people on the street. He there's not really a lot of conflict between him and the other characters. Like, that's one thing
No.
I think to zoom in on, is like the main conflict in Desperation, in one sense, is the conflict between David and Johnny, not
Mhm.
really the conflict between the characters in Tack, because it's the spiritual conflict. It's like the conflict is Johnny going to save his soul, not are they going to successfully defeat Tack. And so there's a lot of conflict there. But in this one, it's mostly like sort of all the rational, level-headed characters being very much on the same side pretty much consistently throughout the entire story. And then you have, I guess it's Cammy. Is that her name? It is funny that I do admit that I have trouble keeping track of the names in this book, like you said, but she's sort of awful. And
She's the
so,
mother of the twins,
sh-
that one of them
sh-
dies, yeah.
yeah. And no, she's not even the one I'm thinking of, though. I mean, she's sort of irrational, but like, she's probably no more irrational than a normal person would actually be in a situation that was this
Yeah.
ridiculous.
You're
Eh,
probably thinking of Kim Geller, who's the racist one that
Geller,
just kinda goes crazy,
yes.
yeah.
And she's the worst, because yeah, she's being super racist. She, like, isn't helping. She's like actively being unhelpful and just being like,
Yeah,
no, I'm gonna just hide with my daughter, and y'all can do whatever you want, but I'm not gonna
yeah.
help. And even that, like, there was some conflict there, and it was fine. It was, it was good, but it didn't culminate in any kind of stakes, right? Okay, that's not quite true either. The stakes
I
that it
mean,
culminated in was her shooting Audrey and Seth.
yeah.
um
Well,
and
was it
then
Cammy or Geller that shot?
I don't even remember.
I think it was Cammy that ended up killing, Seth because for revenge for her son, I think.
Yeah, that makes more sense to
See,
me,
they're both
actually.
kind of crazy in different ways. That's
Yeah.
that's one of the problems I have is those two characters feel so similar to me, except the only difference is one of them is racist and the other is a murderer. I
Uh-huh.
guess is the difference.
Yeah.
But no, I see your point here. But just flipping the names.
Yeah.
Um,
I was kind of all over the place there. What I was attempting to do is trace this idea of like the lack of conflict between Johnny and the other characters, the lack of any kind of central spiritual struggle. I mean, there's simply a lack of spiritual struggle. It's just not about that. That's just not what the book is about. It's
yeah,
It's a
which
very
is the
concrete. Yeah.
which is the most glaring omission, right? Is the
Mhm.
thing that I think you notice more than anything is Desperation was so much about God and that struggle and that question of what is God, what does it mean to have like that question of pneuma, right? What does it mean to have a soul? What does it mean to be spiritual? What does it mean to live and to believe and all these things? And that is not what this book is about at all. And it's omission that I think we find perhaps the point of this whole thing.
Uh-huh.
There was someone on our subreddit that was talking about Regulators and Desperation, and they put it better than I could have, which is Desperation is a story about purpose, about like this is God's plan for you, this is what God wants, and this is what your purpose in life is. There is no purpose to anything that happens in the Regulators, right? There's no plan. Like yes, Seth happens to drive by the mine and is therefore invaded by Tack, but that's not. I mean, that's not God's plan because we're not told. Like, there's nothing. The word
Mhm.
God, I don't think, is mentioned. But
Yeah. And
maybe other than like, oh my God, or the ways in which we colloquially use religious terms in our life, but like. Everything that happens in the Regulators has no greater purpose to it. Like, it's just people suffering and finding a way through it, and it's just, right, here's the word, random, right? It
yeah.
is this the project of the 90s. Now it feels, starting with Insomnia and maybe concluding with these two books, is the idea of examining the difference between purpose and random, the difference between an idea and an idea of King is creating these two scenarios and these two worlds. In one of them, God exists. God is a character, is a presence in the novel, unequivocally. He's here, he's talking to our characters, he's influencing the events. In the other, God doesn't exist. We don't mention God. There is no God in the world of the Regulators. And through that lens, what happens in these books, and what does that say about what, if our central question of the Desperation project is what is the nature of God? What does God as cruel mean? And then you have, your other experiment over here that says, okay, take God out of that and let's see what things look like.
Yeah.
Um,
I I think there's a lot to that. I will say there's another term to this equation that we could add, which is the way the book ends,
mhm.
which is really remarkable because it is the most direct depiction of an afterlife in any Stephen King book that I can think of, which
Mhm.
is fitting that it's not a Stephen King book, but we get once again an epistolary sort of epilogue of this woman staying at the the same retreat where
The Mohawk, whatever. Yeah, but
yeah,
yeah.
the place where Audrey sort of would retreat to in her mind, except it's the real physical place, and apparently there's ghosts there, and the ghosts are obviously Audrey and Seth, and they are described as being like happy there together, and they appear frequently, and um and it's like, okay, well, yes, everything you just said is right in terms of we didn't get the characters really having to confront the idea of God or higher power at any point explicitly. Um, and yet it seems like all of this you could, okay, so having read both books, you can stand back from this whole thing and be like, well, the characters didn't know that they were serving God, but God hates Tack, hates the shit out of that guy. And despite the fact that the China pit collapsed like a week later in the Regulators just randomly, because it's the universe of the random, I guess.
Well,
He
I think
still
they said it
wants.
was blown up. I do think they
Oh,
said it
okay.
was blown up.
Oh, yeah. You could be
So
right. I don't
there
remember.
is an implication that like someone else went in and blew it up.
Yeah, I literally don't remember. You could be right, but in any case, these people are serving God in fighting and ultimately defeating Tack by literally shooting the little boy and killing him, and that this is serving God, because how else are you really gonna? gonna do it. Like, so, and so, you kill Tack, you kill Seth, you kill Audrey, who really didn't even need to die at all. And it's almost like Audrey's death in this moment is like God making sure that they can be together, or like something really kind of dark like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you, I mean, and that's what Johnny says, by the way. He says, well, he doesn't say that. What he says is that Seth took her with him or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was, even in that moment, I was thinking about all this stuff because I was processing this in context of desperation. And I was like, well, did Seth take her with him, or did God just arrange things so that they would die together, because that has a nice kind of symmetry to it, and now they get to live in the afterlife together.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I think, okay, all of that rambling culminates. The point I'm trying to make is so interesting that it's such a like a spiritual book, and then it gets this massive, like, the afterlife is real and they're ghosts together and they're happy, which is, that never happens in any Stephen King books. It's always
Yeah.
a question. It's always ambiguous,
I like that, especially because the one book that is super ambiguous in is Desperation, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
Desperation is a book where characters are like, I don't know if there's anything after death, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's actually a heaven. The one place we see is the land of the dead, where, is that the fun heaven we're promised? Are we going to hang out there? Actually,
Uh-huh.
it seems like everyone's pretty miserable there, actually.
Yeah.
And yeah, so like the idea that you have this incredibly spiritual book that is very uncertain about the existence of heaven, and then you have this incredibly aspiritual book in which our characters basically move to a different plane of existence. And the thing I like most about it is the implication that, like, they are continuing to change and grow. Like, it's not that they have put themselves in some stasis, right, where they're just living like she was doing, just like living this period in her life over and over again. The one thing they find is the lady that's writing the letter in that section finds the Cassie Styles action figure, the dream floater, the one that was Seth's favorite, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the implication of that is, like, I don't think he's just going to casually lose it, that he just doesn't need it anymore, that
Mm-hmm.
he's growing up, he's changing, he's evolving as a being that still exists on some sort of plane of existence that, yeah, we'll call it heaven, right?
Yeah.
I agree with everything you're saying there. I do think that, like, because the book we're kind of told that what Seth did here was he actually just transferred his consciousness, his soul, we'll call it, out of his body. And like, that's the way he tricks Tack, is like, oh my God, Seth's not even in here anymore. I didn't know. Oh, he's stronger than I thought. And he does it to Audrey as well. I think it's interesting to think about, like, whether or not Seth wanted her to die too. It's certainly dark, because I mean, we do learn that, like, we thought the whole time that it was Tack, urging Cammy to shoot and kill him,
Mm-hmm.
and kill Seth. But we learn at the end that no, that was Seth doing that. That Seth is the one screaming, shoot, do it. Like in a very Tack like way, he was kind of manipulating her to do violence. So yeah, there's some idea that, like, he knew the only way to stop this was for him to die, and he took he took his mama with him.
Yeah. 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 That to me was the most emotionally effective stuff, by
Yeah.
the way. Just once again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we said, and I think we agreed, 5 minutes ago, that there's no spiritual struggle to the book, but I do think the emotional, maybe it isn't spiritual, but the emotional struggle to the book is Audrey being torn between the totally understandable terror and dread and hopelessness, and yet loving this boy, and never letting go of her love of this boy. Like, that's the heart of this book.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
authentic relationship?
I agree, and I really just love it as, like, an experiment of what do we mean when we talk about cruelty and love. Like, in one hand we talk about uh, attributes of a higher power that exists and is all around us, and is asserting its will on the world in the ways that it can. And then we talk about, in this book, it's just people. It's people, and how people, the choices people make and the things people do. And I find this a really fascinating kind of journey of a person who is not quite certain about his faith, and what if I do this? What if in this project I'm doing to examine what it means to have faith, what it means to believe in God, and what it means to not believe in God, to set up two mirror images of each other, one in which God exists and one in which he doesn't. And like, you know, eh, I think so, like Desperation feels to me as this book about like this grand culmination of things, right? Like this is what Johnny's entire life was leading to, is this moment. Everything he's been through, everything he's suffered, everything he's learned was leading to this one moment. For a brief moment, he puts aside his ego, he puts aside his asshole tendencies, and he does the right thing. And that doesn't exist in the Regulators. Like that kind of grand, like it's a biblical story, and the Regulators is not a biblical story. It is a story where just a bunch of shit happens, and it's awful and sad, and maybe at the end a little redeeming. Yeah, sure, but I think there's a point to that, and I don't even know what it is ultimately. Like I don't know what the conclusion is. I don't think there needs to be a definitive conclusion of all this, but it is through the lens of the spirituality of Desperation that I find the most meaning in the Regulators, in the intentionality of the lack of meaning.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because I think I was trying to round everything out in my own head by saying, why do it this way? Like why not just write the Desperation? If he wants to say these things,
Yeah.
why do this at all? And part of me does actually feel, I think, like you were just saying, that there's a kind of extra oomph, a kind of extra closure to reading Desperation and then reading the Regulators and feeling like certain things in Desperation were kind of underlined or emphasized, maybe even emphasized by their absence in the Regulators.
Mm-hmm.
And that giving you a stronger sense of what he's trying to do with this, what he's trying to say, what he's trying to do with these books.
Yeah, I think so. Ultimately, I think so, and I think that doesn't speak, in my opinion, highly of the Regulators as a standalone novel, because I think as a standalone novel, it is like the textbook of, hey, this was fun, and that's all. Whereas, like, I think Desperation is kind of this, for all its messiness, and we talked plenty about that. We don't have to relitigate that. I think it is a book that is trying very hard to explore pretty complicated, difficult ideas. And I respect it for that. And so even when it doesn't work in some ways, I'm like, yeah, but like it's making me think about all these things, and it's making me explore the way I feel about these things and what I believe in, and how I struggle with those things. The Regulators did none of that for me, except in how it relates to Desperation. So as a standalone thing, I don't think it works at all. As outside of a very surface level, as a collective project, I think it is one of the more fascinating things King has done.
Yeah, I also just to talk. I don't have the right words for this because we don't usually talk about books in this way, but there's just kind of a raw enjoyability
Mm-hmm.
that King's writing possesses at the level of prose and at the level of sort of what he focuses on,
Mm-hmm.
and the character's internality, such that even though the Regulators is really quite a mess in a lot of ways, like imagine trying to just describe the Regulators to someone. Like, where do you even start? Like
Yeah,
what is it? What is the story? It's quite a tall order to do that.
sure.
Despite all of that, it's very enjoyable. It's a page turner. You're always into what's happening, even if what's happening is absurd,
Yeah.
and it keeps you turning the page. It's that in and of itself is hard to do, because if something becomes too absurd, then normally you just stop caring, because you're just like, well, it doesn't matter. We've lost the plot. We're just off in weird psychedelia, and I don't care about these characters, and I don't care what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of this book having its flaws, I never really felt that way. I was always interested in what was going to happen. I was always interested in what character choices were going to happen, and the ultimate resolution, and finding out the answers to some of the mysteries. So that's just, if anything, the sheer weirdness of the book underlines King's fundamental storytelling talents,
Yeah.
actually.
I completely agree with that. I read this book in like 3 days.
Hmm.
I absolutely tore through it. And I do think that's, despite all the flaws that we talked about, I think that's it's a readable book. It's very readable. You
Hmm.
it's quick, it's fast. You turn the pages, it keeps you going, it keeps you pushing forward constantly. It's a good book. It is. It's just not, it doesn't feel substantial. And not all books have to feel that way, right? But the books that I tend to really really love do.
Hmm. Yeah, sure. So the ones that stick with me for the rest of my life tend to feel substantial, but there's also, they're not all gonna be that way. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I love that King writes crazy stuff like this, and then he writes really serious stuff that's impactful and meant to be literature, and
Mhm.
exercises these different parts of himself. Um, it's inspiring to me.
Yeah, I think there is a certain amount of pleasure that I get out of the idea that like the Johnny Marinville from Desperation would absolutely despise this book
Uh-huh.
um, as not serious literature. Um,
Oh, sorry. You just reminded me. Like, okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, actually, because I could have just not grasped something. But several times in Desperation, he brags to himself, um, about having won the National Book Award, and about what hot shit he is. But it's not. It's actually in this book where this Johnny Marinville thinks about having won the National Book Award for a book about incest.
yeah, yeah.
And I just thought that was so interesting that little detail never appears in Desperation. Um,
No,
I don't
it
know that
does
there's a
not.
point to it, but I just thought it was interesting. I just thought it was like, oh, like,
Right.
uh,
And the assumption of weird sex stuff.
yeah.
I also want to. I know we're gonna get emails about this, and I literally just occurred to me that like I do want to make sure that there is technically some religion that exists in the Regulators, right?
Sure.
There are the characters of the family that ends up moving out
Yeah, that's true.
that steals the power wagon from Seth.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I mean, like that is there is technically mention of God and Jesus very briefly in those characters, but it is like kind of soundly rejected, right? Like
Yeah.
those characters, and King does what I think King very typically does with his religious characters is like exposes them for the bullshit artists they are, right? Like they are
Yeah.
people that are kind of using religion as a shield, but don't actually want to do anything or live by any kind of serious way. That
Yeah.
he makes his son come over here and apologize for taking the thing, but the second that she requires something of him that's out of his idea of penance, he's completely against it. It's all
Right.
bullshit.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you remembered this because I forgot, but it did feel very thematically important at the moment, because specifically, he says, forgive me," and she says, "Well, like, you understand that what you did was wrong,"
Hmm.
and then immediately both the boy and his father are like, "What the hell are you trying to pull on us?" Like, and it's funny and also kind of horrible.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting because it's highlighting this sense of like, um, you know, uh, justice and uh, it, it's gesturing at the idea of justice in the greater scheme of things, where
Hmm.
it's like, um, is it enough to, or rather, like, can you even ask for forgiveness if you don't actually acknowledge that you've done something wrong? Um, Now, I don't know that goes anywhere. Like, that, this is like a genuine problem with the Regulators relative to Desperation. Is I totally forgot about that, and the reason is it doesn't connect up to anything else in the story. Whereas
Yeah.
that sort of stuff is rife all through Desperation, and we would not have forgotten if it had been Desperation. So
yeah, the function of those characters in the Regulators is just like a thing that Seth Tack can take his rage out on in a way that's scary and disturbing and escalates the stakes of what's happening in Audrey's house. And that's really it. You're absolutely right. Like there's not some deeper meaning you can glean from that unless you compare it to to Desperation.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anything else you wanted to say about the Regulators?
No, I think I guess just a more meta comment is some people said, hey, y'all didn't point out the Dark Tower connections, and we were kind of saving that for this conversation, and honestly, the Dark Tower connections are, it's not that they're not there, it's more that they're not, that they don't announce themselves. And so it's like, yeah, we've got this idea of twinners, we've got this idea of parallel universes, but do we have this idea of twinners in parallel universes? Because the text itself never says, like, there's a relationship between these stories. This is all extra textual. This is all just Stephen King putting out 2 books and kind of going, like the books don't really textually reference each other. They obviously reference each other metatextually,
right?
And so to me, I'm like, I mean, it's a Dark Tower connection in a sense, but it's not really a Dark Tower reference in the sense that I normally mean when I say it's a Dark Tower reference. And then we did talk about like the Kanta and like the language and stuff. We talked about that.
Well, like, I mean, Insomnia has the Crimson King in it, right? Like Salem's Lot has Father Callahan in it. There is nothing in these books outside of just the general idea of twinners as a concept, and which we specifically didn't talk about in that episode because we weren't talking about this book yet, so we couldn't. And that idea of multiverse storytelling, right? Which yeah, exactly what you said, like exists in the Dark Tower as a textual thing that exists in Stephen King's multiverse, but here is just 2 examples of that don't function in that regard outside of your extra textual consideration of them. It is Dark Tower related, and that the concept of twinners shows up later in the Dark Tower as a thing that exists in the Talisman, of course, and then later in Dark Tower as well. But yeah, that's really it, man. I mean, like, it's just not really Dark Towery, and that's fine. It doesn't need to be, but I mean, that's why we didn't really spend too much time on it.
And we're done.
We're definitely done with that. So, and that this has us leave the 90s behind. We talked about this in the very first episode, Matt, that I was uncertain about whether or not I'd make the right pick here. I think there are other books in this decade that I think would be very interesting reads and fun things to talk about. The Green Mile, the work he did with both Gerald's Game and what's the other? Why am I blanking on that other one? Doesn't matter. Okay. The point is, I'm happy we covered this. I had fun with it, even though I struggled with these 2 books probably more than I've struggled with some of the other books that we've covered on the show. I thought this was a fun experiment, and I really like when I see authors doing things like this. He tried it out, and it worked in some ways, it didn't work in other ways, but he gave it a shot.
I mean, the thing that makes me happy about this whole detour is that we've talked so much about the ideas of religion and philosophy throughout all these other books. And this was, to me, the book where he finally was like, all right, I'm gonna kind of nail some things down. I'm gonna lay out my thoughts on these things very explicitly. I'm gonna put some words in the characters' mouths, and I walk away from this feeling a lot more confident and comfortable in my assessments of what he's trying to do with some of these other books. So it shed light on the other books that we've read, and likely on future books as well.
I think you're right. And I'm glad we did it. So from here, we leave the 90s behind. We enter a new millennium, Matt, and with it, we head down to Florida, because we're going to be spending the next few weeks reading Stephen King's Duma Key. Matt, this is I guess the question, you haven't started this book yet, right?
Nope.
What do you know about Duma Key?
Well, okay. I know nothing other than the fact that it takes place in Florida.
Uh-huh.
I think that it is about a guy who lives on the beach on one of the Florida Keys, and then possibly there's a murder and a murder mystery,
Okay.
and I don't know if the character is like a detective or if he's like a writer, or for some reason I want to say he's a writer, like a retired novelist, but that could literally just be like, well, it's Stephen King, so I'm like 50-50 shot there. And that's it, really. I mean, I don't
Mhm.
know. I could actually be wrong about everything I just said except for Florida, right? So
Yeah.
that's all I know.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. This is another one, and we'll talk more about this next week. But this is another one that is probably not the most popular pick for 2000s King, but is one that I find really interesting. As we'll get into next week, the big event that happens between the 90s and the 2000s is the accident in which Stephen King almost dies, and I think a lot of his work in this decade is a reflection of that experience. And I mean, we talked about that when we read The Dark Tower, because those books wrap up in the early 2000s. This book came out in 2008, so it is almost a decade removed from that incident, and I think therefore it allows him to reflect on it in a way that's not like immediate reaction, but more he sat with this thing for a while. And we'll get into all this stuff in detail when we actually get into the source material itself. But I think it's a really interesting book, and I think it's going to have a lot to talk about in with this stuff. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Can't wait.
Yeah, so next week we will be getting Duma Key. We're going to be reading the opening chapter all the way through chapter 3. This is a long section that's about 90 pages, but it was a good break point. So that will begin next week, and so get reading, and it's gonna be good. It's gonna be good, Matt. I've been looking forward to this one.
All right. Well, that sounds great. And remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or over on x.com @kingslingerspod. And of course, over on the subreddit at r/doofmedia is a great place to get involved in some discussions. We haven't had discussion questions for a few weeks now because we've been doing unusual sorts of episodes, but regardless, there are always fun conversations happening over there. I remember there have been a couple of quite funny threads this last week that people should check on.
Yeah, no, I agree. Discussion questions will return next week, but until then, yeah, just talk about whatever. Talk about King. Talk about our other shows we're doing. We're doing some Oscar shows right now, and I think that some good discussions can be had about these very interesting movies that just came out this past year.
Yeah, I guess we could mention that we're doing a series where we watch all of the Best Picture nominated movies for this year, and we do podcasts over on the Doofcast. People know that we have another podcast called the Doofcast, right? Everyone knows that.
I hope so.
How often do we mention that? It's
Not
weekly.
often.
If you need a fix. And yeah, we've done several of these last year movies and enjoyed all of the ones we've talked about so far, actually.
Well, by the time people are listening to this, we will have done 5 of the 10, and I don't think that statement you just said will be true anymore.
Okay, you're probably right. Maybe it'll be one of those weeks where we like it more after we've talked about it.
Yeah. I mean, we're recording this in the past because Matt is going to be out next week, so we haven't had recorded that episode yet, even though it came out last Friday. We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah, that movie that we're talking about is the movie Maestro, by the way. That will be the latest episode available when you're listening to this.
Yep.
So you should check that out.
Yep.
But if you're not already subscribed to Kingslingers, the beginning of Duma Key is the perfect time to do it. This is a new novel, and new novels is always a great time to join. So if you just, found this podcast and saw that someone was talking about the Regulators and said, I like that book, subscribe and follow us through Duma Key all the way into the 2010s and the 2020s, because we got a few more books left to go, Matt, and they're all going to be good ones. I'm excited.
Awesome. Yeah, if you like Kingslingers or the Doofcast and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia. We've always got cool stuff happening over there, and particularly lately we've been watching Castle Rock, the TV show, and discussing it on a bonus Patreon podcast called Castle Talk, and we will be releasing the second episode of that in a week or two.
A week, I think, on Valentine's Day, the 14th.
Awesome.
That's coming out. Yeah. Really loving that show. Loving talking about that show. It's really great. And yeah, you should also listen to our book club. If you liked this discussion about this book, that we did one book in 90 minutes, you should tune into the book club. We stream those live on YouTube every month. Our patrons pick a new book and we read it and talk about it. The one for January has already happened for you. It is the Justin Cronin book, The Ferryman. And I don't know what February's is going to be yet, because again, we're in the past, but it's a lot of fun. It's one of our favorite things to do, and we love when people attend live on Friday nights and hang out with us and talk about books. So yeah, check that out. That's on the same feed. The audio versions of that is on the same feed as the Doofcast. So you just head over to the website and check that out.
Yeah, that's right.
But if you cannot afford to donate and be part of any of the stuff, that is okay. You can share it. You can share it with people. Please do that, especially as we start Duma Key. I think we have some people that dropped off because they weren't really interested in Desperation or the Regulators, but might want to come back when Duma Key starts, and you can help them figure out that we've moved on to a new book now by sharing the podcast, by mentioning to people, by talking to people about it, and of course by leaving us rating and reviews on Apple Podcasts and those other sites that do that. No new review to read this week, but please keep those coming.
Right.
All right, folks, that is it. Duma Key begins next week. I can't wait. It's going to be so much fun. We'll see you then. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.